Hi, it's Michael talking about really how much horsepower is needed in real world to keep up with traffic. I live in Toronto, huge metropolitan area. My riding is a mixture of commuting and weekend getaways out of the city, plus some road trips. And I've had a number of bikes, most of them smaller engines or small engines, and now the latest one, pretty decent power. So I just would like to share my experience, because if one would have to believe a lot of the marketing BS and online publications and printed motorcycle publications, we would basically need maybe a liter bike with 100 horsepower. Otherwise, nothing much. So how much horsepower is really needed to keep up with normal traffic? This is my commuter bike, Vespa GTS 300 Super Sport, 278 cc's, 21 horsepower at the crank, 16 horsepower at the rear wheel, and 16 foot-pounds of torque. 20 horsepower and 16 foot-pounds of torque feels zippy enough. It can be quite a lot of fun. In the city, it easily blasts off the stop sign or street lights, leaving cars behind. It's not that cars wouldn't have enough power, it's just that most people don't drive very fast. So in the city, 20 horsepower is plenty. On the country roads, 20 horsepower is enough. It's the happiest around 80 kilometers or 50 miles per hour. Above it, it starts slowing down a little bit. It has enough passing power. It has enough power to accelerate uphills and keep speeds uphill. And as a benefit of the smaller engine size is that the bike is light. It is nimble, it is agile, and if it's dropped, it's much easier to pick up, and if it has to be pushed or you end up in mud or something, it's much easier to deal with. So it has a lot of advantages. Just to show how 16 foot-pounds of torque and 20 horsepower can nicely accelerate up a steep hill, we are coming to one of the steepest hills around. It's not very long, but it is really steep. It may not look so on the camera, but it's quite steep. So accelerating full throttle, and it keeps on pulling and accelerating, and at the top of the hill it was showing 90 on the speedometer, but that's 10% positive. So 80 km per hour at the top of the hill, and it was still accelerating. So 16 foot-pounds of torque, 20 horsepower, plenty for acceleration uphill. By that is meant uphill on country roads that have speeds around 80 kilometers per hour or 50 miles per hour, maybe slightly more. Of course, if that steep uphill would be on a highway, freeway, then the engine would start slowing down somewhat. Not drastically, but it would slow down. And now the highway performance of 16 foot-pounds of torque and 21 horsepower. Obviously, it's not at home on the highway. It can do it for short hops, but the engine is maxed out at highway speeds, legal highway speeds, 100, 110 kilometers per hour or 60 to 70 miles per hour. This particular bike, Vespa the maximum speed, real speed, not indicated, real speed is 115 kilometers per hour. So that's about 70 miles per hour. So to do longer rides on the highway, it can be done. I've done it when I was touring on a previous Vespa 300, but it's probably not good for the engine in the long run to run 90 to 100% of its power output for longer periods of time. So it can be done if it needs to be done, and obviously it's got less. If there needs to be an acceleration, then it is very slow. So passing on the highway is rather not. The best is to stay in the slow lane and just keep on chugging there. Okay, the next bike is my previous motorcycle, Honda CB300F, with 30.5 horsepower at the crank and 26 at the rear wheel and 19.9 foot-pounds of torque. Plenty of power in the city, plenty of power on the country roads, good enough passing on country roads, especially when you shift down, and decent power on the highway, except it sits at 75% of its rev range at the legal speed limit, which is fairly high, and who knows how it may affect the engine in the long run. Passing power on the highway is nothing extra. It is fairly slowish, but it can still be done, and the top speed is supposed to be about 145 kilometers per hour. The next bike, Honda Ruckus, 50cc engine, about 4.5 horsepower, probably at the crank, and about -1 horsepower at the rear wheel. And it probably has more torque than a torque wrench. It has enough power for congested downtown streets, and it is an absolute blast to ride on empty country roads. And it has plenty of power to pass turtles, slugs, and parked Ferraris. And the last bike is my current motorcycle, F750 GS, with just 77 horsepower and 65 foot-pounds of torque. After all that has been said so far, it's obvious that it has more than enough power for the city, for the country roads, and it has also more than enough power for the highway, for normal riding. And at the highway speed limit, it sits around 4,000 RPMs, which is its mid-range, which undoubtedly is very good for its for the engine's longevity, that it can happily burble at that gentle RPMs for long periods of time. On the other hand, the downside of all that is the weight. Obviously, it's much heavier than the previous bikes, and as the result, it may it can be challenging to handle at low speeds, very challenging to push around on uneven ground, or if you get stuck in the mud or sand or something. So that needs to be taken into consideration. As a conclusion to this video, I'd say that a motorcycle with 20 horsepower is plenty enough for country roads. By that I mean roads with 80 km per hour or 50 mile per hour limit. Plenty enough, and it's okay for short hops on the highway. It won't be the most happy there, but it's doable, it's survivable, so that's fine. A 30 horsepower bike will do the same service on country roads, will be more than enough in the city, and on the highway it's more suitable to highways. As already mentioned, at the legal speed limit the engine is running at about 75% of its RPMs. Probably not ideal in the long term, like if there is a lot of long highway riding, but for shorter hops it's fine. And 70-80 horsepower engine is it's tons enough for all situations, except maybe for racing, but for real world riding it's more than enough. And it would seem that probably the most useful horsepower range for a motorcycle that needs to cover highway riding, country road riding and commuting is about 45 to 55 horsepower. That seems to be the most reasonable. More is really not needed. So that's about it. If all that you can afford is a small engine bike, it's perfectly fine. It should do fine. Its benefits are low weight, agility. If it breaks down on the side of a road, it's more easy to handle than pushing a quarter-ton gorilla or handling quarter-ton gorilla. So small bikes have a lot to go for them, as long as it fits utility-wise and ergonomically. Thanks for watching. Michael out.